perfect song too. All right, so here is your warm-up activity. So you guys are going to give me one sentence. Don't give me a word, give me a sentence. One sentence, and I want you to tell me, what is the American dream? Like when you hear that, what does that mean? Like philosophically speaking, not, I don't want you to be like, the American dream is that I have a house with some dogs and a Porsche, okay? That idea, what is the idea of the American dream? What is the idea of the American dream? I'm gonna give you 2 songs. All you have to give me is one sentence, and you have to give me something, even if it starts with, I don't know, but I think it means this, okay? I don't know is not an option. You gotta give me something, okay? Take a risk, give it a try. You get 2 songs, go. In the chat, type it out. All right, you got one more song to get your idea in. While you are waiting for other people to get their ideas in, I want you to scroll up through the comments, and I want you to like 3 comments that you kind of agree with. I want you to like 3 comments, but it can't be your own, okay? So like 3, and just like highlight the little, go over here, put a little heart next to it or a little thumbs up next to it, and you're just gonna like 3 that you agree with that are not yours, okay? All right, one more song. Okay, so looking at your responses here, I got a couple of late ones in, so make sure you guys like 3. Looking at your responses, looks like the number 1 is, quote, freedom to be successful regardless of your upbringing or background. Okay, so that was a lot of people agreed with that one. And then it looks like the idea that you can be whoever you want and accomplish your goals. Well, we got a couple of ties down here. I believe that the American dream stands for becoming successful, reaching your goals in life, and coming up from ground zero. To have opportunities no matter your background or culture. Oh, actually, I think this is the most popular one. The American dream is achieving success through hard work. Okay. And there's a few others that you guys definitely sort of came to a consensus on, like, yeah, that sounds right. Okay, good, excellent. Yep, okay. And so let me explain how this is going to work. So we are starting The Great Gatsby, and I am warning you now that, like, I'm going to be so extra about this book that it's going to annoy you. It's easier to take me when we're in person because I have more room to move around and I'm less a lot. But because there's only me in this small square teaching to you, I'm going to be like a lot. And you guys are my first period class, which means that you're going to take the brunt of it because I lose energy by the end of the day. And I have lots of energy right now. So brace yourself because here we go. First of all, if you don't have a copy, like a physical copy of The Great Gatsby, I strongly urge you to get one, just because this type of novel that we are going to be reading, we're diving really deep into it. I don't ask you guys to do a whole bunch of critical thinking, especially when we're in this weird time period when stuff is weird. But one of the standards that I'm supposed to cover with you guys is ELA GSE 11-12. RL8, which has to do with these big thematic, philosophical, challenging ideas. What is the foundation of literature? So too, looking at the data, because the state always wants to bring in the data, that's one of the things that you guys struggle with. How do I read a text and find something abstract like a theme, right? And we talked about that at the very beginning of the year, how part of my job is really difficult to do because I'm trying to teach you these abstract thematic concepts, but you haven't experienced a whole bunch of life yet. So how do we dive into those? So I'm going to tell you that if ever a book were to get me fired, this would be the book. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, not Huck Finn, not Beloved, not any of those books. The book that could potentially get me fired is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. But if I go out with a bang. Okay, so here's how it works. F. Scott Fitzgerald is an author, and we are looking at the arguments of the author. Okay. when you look at someone's argument, you will have a visceral reaction to it. Just like when you guys put in the chat there, the American dream means this to me, right? When you read other people's understandings of the American dream, you either agreed with it or you disagreed with it, or you were ambivalent to it, which, by the way, ambivalence, SAT word, means that you believe something about this and something about that. It's both things simultaneously. Ambivalence does not mean I don't care about it. That's apathy. You might have been apathetic towards it. Ambivalence, apathy, anger, agreement, disagreement, all of those are emotions. All of those are emotions. Even if you say that you don't feel something, not feeling something is actually still feeling something, right? Because you are putting that forth, okay? So that means that when we have something like this, and this novel is really super cool in the way that it does it, when we have something like this, you are being presented an argument in a way that might seem unclear to you. You may just be like, hey, this is an argument about a guy who went to the city and saw a whole bunch of rich people and like sort of fell in love with this one girl and then like wasn't in love with her anymore, and like that's the argument. If that's the only argument that you want to look at, if you only want to look at this at a very ground level of like this is a character moving through a narrative and there's like some personal reaction that I have to, there's nothing wrong with that. I will, however, argue that that is probably the most entry level aspect of analysis. So like when we're talking about analyzing literature, which is part of the goal of this course, is to be able to read a text that is nonfiction and be able to analyze it. When we're analyzing literature, we have to keep in mind that this is not just a story, right? This is an argument. And my job as a literature teacher is to show you where the arguments exist. It's kind of like a treasure map, okay? I need to give you some idea of where these arguments are so that when you're reading, you're like, that is a symbol for this particular argument. And let me make something very, very clear so I don't get fired. The arguments that exist in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby are arguments that people are having right now. People are having arguments about what is in this book right now. And I don't mean that they're standing around going, oh, well, you know, in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, he said that. No, what I mean is the ideas that are presented here about what the American dream is and what the American dream means and what it means for an individual and what it means for an individual with power or without power. Those are literally the debates that are happening right now. Right? So like I said, if there's ever a book that could get me fired, this is the one. But I'm going to teach you in a way that I present the information to you so that you can make your own decision. And again, let me make this very clear. You should at no point in time know how I feel about these issues. Okay? When it comes to examining capitalism, when it comes to examining the individual in society, when it comes to examining societal responsibilities to the individual, you should not know my own personal viewpoint, because that is not my position or place as a teacher. That is not my job. That is above my pay grade. That's your parents' job. That's your community's job. That's your, church or your synagogue's job or your temple's job. That's their job. My job is simply to say, here is the author. Here are the arguments that the author presents to you, and you get to decide what you think. Okay? So a couple of things before we get into this whole big journey that's going to kind of blow your mind. Really early in the morning. I'm sorry you guys have me for first period, but like, it is what it is. So one of the things that I want to tell you about is an assignment that I posted to Microsoft Teams. That's the anticipation guide. For those of you that are like a little intimidated by this book and you're like, oh man, I don't know, Hannah, this sounds like this is going to be really, really difficult for me because I'm not about that critical thinking level. Cool. Do the anticipation guide. It's a practice grade. Do the anticipation guide, because remember I told you that level, that like entry level analysis where it's like, this is a story about a guy that kind of falls in love with a girl and then leaves, right? If that's what you want to do, that anticipation guide will greatly help you, okay? Hang on, I see a hand up. Gallagher, question.
Is it practice grade? Is that going to the grade book?
Good question. So the practice grades, remember we talked about this on Tuesday, the practice grades are not going to immediately go into the grade book. Instead, the practice grades are going to be one of those sort of like, hey, we're at the end of this unit at the end of the semester, and like, I did really poorly on this quiz. Like, is there something that I can do about this particular quiz, right? Because we're enacting the new minor grades, not pass the unit thing, right? So if you do, let's say, for example, you do 7 practice grades, then I can look at that and be like, hey, we can go ahead and substitute like 5 of these practice grades and to help that quiz grade get to where it needs to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That help? Okay, good. All right. So like I said, for the, put my chat back up. So Gallagher, put your hand up. There you go. So for the entry level, like if you're already kind of intimidated by all of this, the entry level is going to be the anticipation guide where you can relate the ideas in Gatsby back to yourself. So you can say, okay, this is kind of what's happening in this particular novel. Like, I understand it on a very personal level, meaning like as a person going through this world. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that's the level that you want to keep it at, awesome sauce. Okay, so that's level one when we talk about analysis. How does it relate to me? Okay, and Bloom's taxonomy would be like the lowest level of identification. Again, it's not that it's bad, it's just an entry level. Okay, maybe you're the type of person that's like mid-level. You're like, I kind of get symbolism, I kind of get theme, and like from what I can tell through your writing and through the things that you guys are telling me in class discussion, most of you guys are at this mid-level where it's like, I know that they're saying something, like I know that there's a theme there. I'm okay at picking out some parts of it, but some parts I'm not, okay? So that mid-level is gonna be relating everything thematically right now to what's happening in the world today. Like when F. Scott Fitzgerald starts talking about like corruption and starts talking about like environmental issues, maybe in your mind you're like, oh, that's kind of like why everyone's freaking out about all the weather stuff. And like that kind of relates to like what we're dealing with today as far as industrial pollution and stuff like that. That's mid-level, okay? Taking the idea and not relating it just personally to you, but to the world that's happening right now, okay? And some of you guys are at that mid-level. And a few of you guys are going to be the most upper level, and that's the philosophical level, okay? My job as your 11th grade teacher, I'm going to make you uncomfortable, is to get you from that either entry level to the mid-level, or from the mid-level up to the higher critical thinking level, okay? And you're going to get yourself there. And for those, and I've had kids before who are at the highest level of critical thinking, all I'm going to give you is philosophical questions that have no answers. I'm just gonna be like, that's a great question. What about this idea, right? Because some of you are smarter than me, and like, I'm lucky to be able to be your teacher, right? So for those kids, I'll just give you a greater philosophical question that we don't know the answer to, okay? Level one, how does it relate to me? Level two, how does it relate to my society? Like what's going on today, right now? Level three, highest level of critical thinking, what is the philosophical understanding? Okay, we're gonna talk a lot of philosophy. We're going to talk about Plato, we're going to talk about Lacan, we're going to talk about Socrates, we're going to talk about Baudrillard, and like, you don't need to know any of these names. They will never, ever, 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 ever be on a test. But they are greater philosophical ideas and questions that will either take you from that entry level to a mid-level or from a mid-level to a high level. And plus, they're just fun. They're fun to talk about. It's one of those things that even if we're in a situation like this where you can't see me hopping around the room like a crazy person, we can still explore a lot of stuff, okay? All right, so anticipation guide for level one learners, or if you just want to do it because it's kind of fun and you want the practice grade, it's on Microsoft Teams. So if you have not already, as a reminder, one of the ways I'm having you guys check in, right, to make sure that you're present while you're present, is to have written in the chat, what is your version of the American dream, okay? Now let's talk about how to read this novel. So like I said, I strongly encourage you to get an actual paper copy if you can. Please be very careful when you're out in the world getting your paper copy. Please make sure that you are wearing your mask. But if you can get your hands on a paper copy, and I'll send something over to the Milton Library and say, hey, any copies that you've got of The Great Gatsby, like sell them immediately. Because the type of annotation that you're going to want to do, you see that? Like, this is what we're talking about, friends. Okay, I know that's backwards so you guys can't read it. I actually, if you go on my YouTube channel, there's a video. It's like the third video on the Gatsby playlist. If you go on that video, I actually have a screenshot of what that is. If you want to set yourself up to start reading the Gatsby with me at that third level, that philosophical level, you can see a screenshot of that so that you can make your book like that. So how do you read Gatsby? I use colors because I am sort of like the ADD brain and I need visual cues for myself. And each color in this book represents a different thematic idea. and it's how they progress through the book. So the cool thing about Gatsby is you aren't just like presented this thematic idea, like this little, oh, here's a symbol for this, or this character is supposed to represent that, and then it exists and then it doesn't develop. In Gatsby, everything opens, and for those of you that are at level 3, as a Proustian metaphor. Proustian metaphor just means that it opens up and it expands as the reader interacts with it. So this is one of the, I would argue, so Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, who's one of the greatest American writers of all time, Ernest Hemingway says that there's only one American novel, and he said it's Huck Finn. And I disagree with Hemingway, and Hemingway doesn't care because he is famous and dead, and I am not, either of those things. I think F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby is the American novel. This, to me, is the epitome of what American democracy argues over. You know, in my opinion, and this is my opinion, strictly my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, democracy is based off of debate and deliberation. Our conversations about democracy is what makes us great. The fact that we will never settle and be like, oh, well, you know, everything is fine. That, to me, that is what makes our democracy great, is that we're constantly trying to get better. And we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow, too. We might have time today. What time is it? Okay, 8:43. So anyway, so to me, this is the great American novel. And the way that you move through these symbols and characters and settings and all of the literary terms that we've told you guys before, they don't just exist in a vacuum here. The way that Fitzgerald has situated the text is that when you interact with it and you're like, I'm reading this, but I relate to it in this way, but also it reflects what's currently happening right now in the United States. And the reason that that's happening right now in the United States is that it's a big philosophical issue that humanity hasn't been able to answer. Okay, so if you guys look, if you look in the chat, look at all of our different definitions of American dream, right? Some of the things that we see in those definitions of American dream are similar, but some of them are very different. Some people have a very simplistic view of what the American dream is. Some people have a very personal view of what the American dream is. Some people have a broader sense of what the American dream means. Some people put it in a material sense. Some people put it in an individual sense. So we all have different interpretations of what this thematic idea of the American dream is, which means that when an author writes a book about the American dream and all of the wonderful and awful things that go along with it, we are going to have a reaction to it. But here's what you need to understand. The American dream, that idea of like, I work hard and I become successful, however I define that success, that is not an American idea. That is one of the ideas from the philosopher kings, from like Socrates, Plato, that idea of knowledge and power and placement in this world gives us a type of freedom, right? That if we have the tools that we need to be successful, that there's nothing to stop us. That is absolutely a Greco-Roman idea. And I would say it's a Greco-Roman idea. Let me back that up a little bit. The reason that I know it as a Greco-Roman idea is that I studied the Greco-Roman philosophers. It is probably not just a Greco-Roman idea. I'm sure that there is some Eastern philosophy that embodies it as well. In fact, I'm almost certain that there is. I just don't know it. That is not my wheelhouse. And so because I don't know it, I can't speak on it. Okay. So when we talk about the idea of the American dream, that is that big thematic concept that we've got within this novel. And when you are annotating for it, you're going to see it being broken down and restructured over and over again, right? And because of that, your annotations in the book are going to be very complex. Like you will literally fall into a trap. It's a fun trap with words. And that's one of the things about this novel. And I don't want you to be intimidated by it. So I'm going to give you some suggestions. Before we start reading The Great Gatsby, we're going to start reading it in earnest tomorrow. Before we start reading The Great Gatsby, I strongly urge you to watch the movie. You should know what happens in this novel before we read this novel. If you can't watch the movie, and either one of the movie versions, I like the Baz Luhrmann version, which is like the big Leonardo DiCaprio, like all over the place version. That's the version I like. But either one of the versions that exist out there, I strongly like, y'all get on a Zoom call and like watch it together. Like watch The Great Gatsby as a movie. If you can't do that, go to Schmoop or go to YouTube and like just see a summary of what the book is. Oh, Kohanna, I'm not going to enjoy it. I'm not going to be surprised. That's not the point. The point is not for you to be like, oh, I really like this book. I want you to like the book. I want you to like the book, but that's not what we're doing, right? The goal here is that I give you a skill so that even if you don't like this book, you can still take that skill, because some of you aren't going to like this book. Some of you are going to be like, this is dumb. In fact, the majority of girls that read this book don't like this book because, as Fitzgerald said, this is a man's book. He says it, it's a man's book, okay? So keeping all of that in mind, in order to read this book, step one, watch the movie, watch a summary, because you're not reading this for pleasure. Like, you are reading it in order for you to gain a skill. So keep that in mind, right? And then step two, try to get a physical copy if you can. If you can't get a physical copy and you have to use a PDF, I strongly urge you to have a notebook, not the class notebook. Maybe even something that's like a smaller notebook, like a little bitty, like one of these kind of notebooks, of you just like taking notes outside of that Kindle edition or that thing on your computer. And the reason that I say that is that you need to have something that is like physically standing out to you. So like the reason that I put these little Post-it notes on the sides here like this is so that if I'm looking specifically for like symbols for me are in purple, right? So I'm looking for a symbol here. I found a symbol there, right? You can actually find them physically, and that's what that annoying thing right there. And if you look at this book, it's like falling to pieces, but that annoying thing right there, that will actually help you find it. And that's actually a skill that you can take with you outside of this class, like later on in life, and like when you are annotating stuff for college, like that's what you can do, okay? Which, by the way, I made money annotating novels for people when I was in college. Anyway, so let's talk about the most basic aspect of The Great Gatsby, and then I'm gonna let you guys go because I know that your brain is full. So raise your hand if you've ever heard of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Okay. A couple of you guys. Hands down, clear the board. All right. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of The Matrix. Okay. Okay. Hands down, clear the board. All right. So for those of you that don't know about The Matrix, there's a new one that's come out. I had no desire to see it. I heard it's kind of cheesy. The first Matrix that I saw that I absolutely loved, I loved because it linked into, at the time, what I was studying in college. So like, I'm a total 90s kid. Matrix came out in the 90s. And in The Matrix, at the very beginning, we're presented with this guy named Neo. And of course, all the names mean stuff, right? So Neo means new, or the chosen one, or whatever you want to call him, okay? So Neo is sitting at a computer, and he's basically a hacker, and he gets confronted by a message that basically says, I know who you are, I know what you're doing, I know that you're this hacker guy, right? So he meets up, and there's like this whole chase scene where he chases a white rabbit, which white rabbits are always about curiosity. There's this whole scene where he chases a white rabbit, and Morpheus comes to him and basically says, you have a choice. You can either stay in ignorance in this little world that you have, or you can follow the rabbit down the rabbit hole and you can learn. The question that Morpheus asks him, and then a whole bunch of other sort of metaphorical things afterwards, that all relates back to the philosophical idea of, and I'm going to type it in the chat so you guys can see it, because I'm going to reference this a lot. Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Okay? Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So Plato's Allegory of the Cave kind of works like this. Plato, who is quoting Socrates, and we can never really tell if it's like actually Plato talking or actually Socrates talking, because Socrates never wrote any of his stuff down because he doesn't believe in writing. But anyway, Plato tells the story that Socrates supposedly told. And basically what the story is that you're supposed to imagine a person, okay? Can I see that? Not really. Let's try again. Let's see if this one's better. You're supposed to imagine a person, okay? This person is sitting. Okay, maybe there's like a rock under his butt. So this person is sitting and they have a chain around their neck. And that chain means that they cannot look this way or this way. Okay, so their neck is pinned here. In front of them is a wall. And they see things on this wall, very similar to how you see things on a computer or on your phone, right? They see things come here. And they have lived their life in this cave. They've never been outside the cave, okay? And so all they know is directly what's in front of them on this wall. And it's this person, and then let's say there's another person next to them and another person next to them. So it's like 3 people and they're all chained together and they're all in a situation where none of them have seen either side, but they can talk to each other. And they started making a game and they start naming these things on the wall. And they say, okay, that is, you know, that's a cat, okay? So they say that image right there, we're gonna call that cat, okay? And then the next thing that they see, they say, okay, that image there, that is a vase, okay? So they say that's a vase, and inside the vase is a flower, okay? So they're communicating with each other. And after a while, the images that they see on the wall start to repeat themselves. And they start getting really good at naming the images. Like that's a cat, and that's a vase, and that's a dog, and that's a pen, and that's the sun, and that's reality, and that's love. They start getting really good at naming the things on the wall. But what they don't know is that actually what's happening is not that they can see reality in front of them, but behind them is a fire, and there are people back here behind the fire holding objects, okay? So just like you can see a shadow on the wall, they're not actually seeing the objects. They're only seeing the shadows of the objects. And at some point in time, the chain on our main character of this particular story, the chain breaks and he's able to get free. And he crawls out of this cave. This is called Plato's Allegory of the Cave because it's actually a physical cave. He crawls out of the cave and he enters into the light of reality. He realizes that there's a fire back here that is casting shadow on the wall, and that fire is creating a reality that's not reality. He has an epiphany. He realizes that everything that he thought was real, and he was really good at naming the stuff. He got really good at it, but everything that he thought was real and who he was in regards to this reality on the wall is a shadow of reality. That's not reality. And so what does he do? He leaves the cave and he goes out into this bright light. It's very similar to like if you've ever walked outside after being in a darkened movie theater and you're like, oh God, it hurts, right? So he walks out into this bright light of reality and like his world is completely thrown off, right? He knew what real was and he was good at naming the things, and now he finds out that real is just a shadow on the wall. It's not real, okay? He walks out into this bright light of reality and like it's physically painful and it's mentally painful and he doesn't understand what's going on and everything is crazy and he's kind of losing his mind a little bit, and he has a decision to make, and this is where we get into the philosophy. So does the main character from Plato's Allegory of the Cave go back and free his friends? Does he free his friends, or does he stay out here and kind of live his life? So I want you to tell me in the chat. It's gonna be one of those, make sure you're participating. Does he free his friends, or does he just walk out into reality? Or maybe he goes back into the cave. So tell me what he does. Does he A, free his friends, B, stay in reality and not free his friends, or C, run screaming back into the cave because he doesn't want reality? Which one? Tell me in the chat. A, B, or C. Which one does he do? Make sure you give me an answer, because this is one of the ways that I'm making sure that you are present in this class. Okay, so it seems overwhelmingly that you guys think that he goes back and he frees his friends, okay? So you're right, he does. So he runs back into the cave, and remember there's two other guys, right? One of the other guys, he like pulls out into the open world, and he like, you know, puts it in, like, he sees water for the first time. He never saw water before, right? So he puts his friend down on the ground, and he like rubs water in his eyes, and he's like, look all around you. And his friend is the same way that he is. Like, everything he knows is completely thrown off. And he's like, oh my gosh, what is this? And like his friend kind of loses his mind a little bit and like runs off screaming, but stays in reality. Then he goes back to the other friend in the cave, and he pulls this guy out, kicking and screaming, into the light. And the guy sees everything. And that guy decides to go back into the cave. It's too overwhelming for him. And plus, with the other two guys gone, now he's the guy that's really good at naming the stuff, right? He's really good at being like, oh, that's a this and that's a that. And now I'm the top dog, right? So he's really good at being in this cave. The cave is the cave of ignorance. When you learn something new, something that completely and totally rocks your world and makes everything turn upside down, who you are, the world that you know, the values that you placed, the accomplishments that you had, when that first happens, that epiphany moment, it's painful. It hurts. It hurts. Because what you thought was reality was not reality, all right? So some people decide, I'm in this new realm, it is very scary, it is very overwhelming, and like, I kind of can't handle it, but I'm gonna stay here. Okay, so in the Matrix movies, which you shouldn't watch because it has naughty language and violence, but in the Matrix movies, the first movie, Morpheus says, do you want the red pill or do you want the blue pill? The red pill and the blue pill represent going back into the cave. F. Scott Fitzgerald has a main character who is basically trying to figure out his understanding of the American dream through his choice. And we all have a choice. Does he stay in this cave of ignorance and see the shadows on the wall? Or does he decide to stay in this reality? And here's the thing that you also need to know. In this cave of ignorance that Plato describes, well, that Plato says that Socrates describes, everything is given to this guy. If you're inside the cave of ignorance, you don't have to, you know, try to figure things out. Like, you don't have to like even really think about yourself. You can just sort of zone out and like watch these images flash in front of you. You can be like, that is that, and that is that, and that is that. And you don't have to think a lot. You can just live in this little cave of ignorance. And the third guy chose to go back, and that's his choice. But F. Scott Fitzgerald creates this character, and it's the narrator. He creates this character who sees the outside world and kind of has to make a decision. Do I go back and tell other people about this? Do I tell other people that this is the epiphany that I had? Or do I let them live in this cave of ignorance? Now, if you watch the Baz Luhrmann version, one of the things that Baz Luhrmann decides to do, which I completely disagree with, the very beginning of the movie, you have the narrator who's telling the story. He's in an insane asylum. And that's not, I think the reason Baz Luhrmann did that is because F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife, Zelda, had a lot of problems with like mental illness. And some people say F. Scott Fitzgerald did too, because he drank a whole bunch and like gambled a lot. Maybe he did. But the character never actually is in an asylum, okay? But the telling of the story, this is the decision that the main character makes. The main character decides, the narrator decides that he is going to tell the story of what reality is. Here's what I saw when I was outside the cave. And when he does that, it is his decision to relate everything back to the people in the cave. Because his assumption, F. Scott Fitzgerald's assumption, is that you as the reader are not aware that what you've seen and what you've been presented in regards to the American dream is false. And that's the argument. And this is very important, so I need you to listen carefully. Because if you listen to nothing else, I need you to hear this. F. Scott Fitzgerald makes an argument. And the argument that he makes is definitely slanted in a particular position. So you need to be aware of the fact that what he is presenting to you, you do not have to agree with. You absolutely do not have to agree with it, but you have to be able to identify it. Remember, I told you guys that from day one. You don't have to agree with what these authors tell you, but you have to be able to identify it. And then more importantly, I think having a philosophical background and being able to say, that is based off of a very old idea of this particular thing, and it relates to this thing and this thing and this thing. It allows you to be able to digest the idea and not just say, okay, well, that doesn't really matter, right? I'm challenging you guys on multiple levels because it's very easy for you to be like, I'm just going to watch the movie and then I'll write a report and it's not a big deal. I'm giving you the freedom and I'm giving you the opportunity now to come out of the cave, And by coming out of the cave, I don't mean that you agree with F. Scott Fitzgerald. I mean that you have an epiphany about the way you feel about this book, because that's the most important thing. You should have an opinion about the arguments in this book, because it's an argument. It's a very, very old argument. And yet, it is an argument that we are seeing take place right now. Okay? So, big, huge philosophical idea. In the cave of ignorance, do I disconnect or do I choose to do the hard stuff? Do I choose to do the hard learning? Do I choose to do the hard things? And it doesn't have to be every day, and that's something else I want to make very clear. The reason that we don't do this type of thinking all of the time is that it's exhausting. Like, it is utterly exhausting. When you are with me for 50 minutes a day, or 55 minutes a day when we go back to person, because we are going to go back in person, we will go back in person. When that happens, when you are with me 55 minutes a day, this is the type of stuff that we will do. For 55 minutes, and then you can not do it anymore. I'm not asking you to do it the whole time. But this type of philosophical thinking is what I want you to do, okay? All right, last task, and this is going to be your last checkout, and then you can close this window. I have a task for you, and this will be your ticket out the door. I want you to Google Kohanam, I'm going to put it in the chat, Kohanam vision boards, and I want you to tell me in one sentence, what do you see? Not one sentence, sorry, back up the truck. Tell me in one word, when you Google Kohanam vision boards, what do you find? So I'm sending you on a treasure hunt. That's your ticket out the door. Once you give me that one word, you can close the window. Thanks, Suspect.